Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Sex Matters webinar. Our topic this evening is one that matters to everyone. Toilets, or more generally sanitation. Tomorrow's World Toilet Day, which is an annual fixture in the global economic and social development calendar. And that's when minds focus on the fact that hundreds of millions of people around the world still lack access to safe, hygienic sanitation. And without that, people suffer illnesses, they're at risk of attack, women get raped because the places they go aren't safe, girls drop out of schools that don't have adequate single-sex facilities, and people even die untimely deaths because of waterborne diseases. Of course, in the developed world, we're mercifully not subjected to these issues. But in recent years, trans activists have very successfully lobbied to weaken single-sex provision of all sorts of services that used to be well understood to be better when men and women are separated. So strangely, we sometimes see the same charities and NGOs lobbying for better provision of girls' and women's facilities in the developing world, even at the same time as they're arguing for girls and women in the developed world not to have separate facilities. So with me, I've got two panelists. So Maya Forstater, the Director of Sex Matters, who is going to do a presentation of our Guide to Toilets, which draws on laws and building regulations in this country. But before that, we're going to talk to our guest panellist, Rose George. Rose is a very distinguished journalist who has written several excellent books, always on intriguing topics that allow her to play to her strengths of doing fascinating reporting and in-depth analysis. And she's a beautiful writer too. Her books include one on the global shipping industry and a book about blood. But the relevant book for tonight's webinar is The Big Necessity, which I read in proof in 2008 because I was given it to review for The Economist, and the review was glowing, and the book was one of The Economist's books of the year that year. And one final interesting fact about Rose before I move on to tonight's business, and that is that today's her birthday. So we really appreciate her delaying going out for dinner before, just to do a bit of talking about poo, which has been Rose's life for over a decade now, I think. Right, so what we'll do for this evening is we'll start with Rose, who's going to talk about the importance of single-sex provision in that global picture of the importance of good sanitation. And then we'll come back together just in case there are some points that Maya and I want to pick up from what Rose has said. And then I'll hand over to Maya to do her presentation on our guide. And then the three of us will come back together. And there'll be a Q&A, so you can put your questions in the chat, not in the chat, in the Q&A in Zoom. The whole of the hour will be taken up then by the time we finish the Q&A, except I'll just save a couple of minutes at the end to tell you about Sex Matters' current big push for a petition. Okay, we finish at 8, and the recording will be available on YouTube, certainly in time for World Toilet Day tomorrow. All right, Rose, over to you. Tell us about your exciting adventures in the world of poo.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Helen, and what a privilege to have been invited onto this webinar and to meet digitally the fabulous Maya and the fabulous Helen, although we have already met to talk poop over lunch somewhere posh in London. Toilets. Yes, I have been plunged into the world of toilets since about 2006, and it's been a privilege, but also often a very difficult field to be in, because you travel around the world and you begin to see how many people are in dire straits because of lack of facilities. And when in Helen's introduction she mentioned hundreds of thousands of people have no access to, I'm not sure if you used the word adequate, but actually it's about 2 billion people have absolutely no toilet whatsoever. And about 3 billion people have no access to decent sanitation. And that could just mean a latrine that's emptied or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean a flush toilet with a wastewater system. But anyway, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of toilets around the world. With my book, The Big Necessity, I traveled to, I think it was 7, perhaps 9 countries, including India, China, South Africa. But I also focused on the UK, spent very many happy hours in the public toilets of my hometown of Dewsbury with the toilet attendant, Margaret, who taught me a lot about what it's like to work in a public toilet. But I'm going to start with a poster from Orissa in India. And this poster was pretty or versions of it were pretty common in about 2006, I think it was, that I was traveling around India researching toilets. And I'm afraid I can't remember the exact phrase, but essentially you'll see that there's a toilet in the background, and this is a married couple. The woman has got a red bindi, which I think signifies that she's just been married. And what all these things signify in the poster is that she is saying that she will not go through with the wedding if a toilet is not provided. And Melinda Gates, formerly married to Bill Gates, beautifully summed up this campaign as "No loo, no I do." And it was a pretty vocal and impressive and successful campaign. But the reason it was needed is because it was entirely possible in much of Orissa and in much of India that a woman could be expected to move into a married home and there would be no toilet. So what would she do? She would have to use anything available, a field, a roadside. I was traveling through Orissa with a man called Joe Madiath, who runs a very good charity in Orissa. And there was I think she was a grandmother. She was just squatting by the roadside, and she'd covered her head with her sari, and she was doing what's known in the business as open defecation, pooping in the open, just on a public road, like a highway. And I found that pretty shocking. And Joe said, "Well, yes, it's cover the face, expose the base," which was, amusing, but also absolutely sad and tragic. And yet that is still the reality for millions of women around the world. Can I have the next picture, please? And this publicity campaign was released by a little-known UN agency, which is focused on sanitation. And I thought it was a pretty powerful campaign. And it's actually not very accurate, because that is a ceramic toilet which many women and girls and people in the developing world will not have access to. Even if they do have improved sanitation, they probably will just have a very simple latrine pan in perhaps if they're lucky, a latrine shelter. But I think that signifies, for me, having grown up in what I call the flushed and plumbed world, I find that pretty awful. And I remember going once to a service station in the middle of China, and I was absolutely desperate for the loo. And the translator who was with us, who was a Hong Kong Chinese woman, was also desperate for the loo, and she refused to come into the toilets, and I didn't quite understand why. And then I went in there, and I realized why. It's because there were no doors whatsoever, and it was absolutely public. And I found that shocking and very difficult, but I had to go, so I went. But in many parts of China at that time, it was considered normal. There was considered no need for doors or privacy. So these are standards which can vary around the world depending on culture and background. But essentially, if you ask most women and girls in developing countries what would they like, rather than having to go and shit in the banana field behind their houses, or have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go with their friends in cover of darkness so that they are not seen, which of course puts them at much greater risk of attack and rape, they would like a private toilet. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'm introducing you here to a woman called Priyanka, because Priyanka is a real-life no loo, no I do. And when I encountered that initial poster, it seemed a bit too good to be true that there were women who would stand up for this and who would actually put their foot down and say, okay, no, I am not getting married. It's a very, very brave thing to do, particularly in rural society. And I was at I was working on a traveling sanitation carnival. And someone ran in and said, there's a no loo, no I do woman outside. And I went outside, and there was Priyanka, and she had done exactly that. She had refused to marry her childhood sweetheart because his family had no toilet. She had married him, but then she had moved into the in-laws' house, which was the custom. And she had grown up with a toilet, or a latrine, and then she suddenly found herself having to go out into the field with her mother-in-law. Well, I mean, imagine that. At 4 o'clock in the morning, whether she was ready or not, to do her business, to do open defecation, and she ran away, and which was an extraordinary thing to do. And it was so extraordinary that she became pretty famous throughout India, and she was given a beautiful family toilet. And what does this have to do with the importance of single-sex toilets? Because obviously Priyanka just wanted a family toilet. She wasn't necessarily campaigning for a single-sex toilet. The thing is that a toilet is much more than a waste disposal device. And by toilet, I'm saying, let's say it's a contained room containing a toilet. And for Priyanka, it was the alternative to going out and risking rape and having to poop next to her mother-in-law. But it can be so many things in so many different contexts. As I learned from Margaret in the public toilets in Dewsbury, it can be a changing room. It can be a refuge, perhaps in a nightclub or in a public toilet. It's somewhere to escape the male gaze or male harassment or hostility. There are women who have miscarriages in toilets. Obviously, women and girls need it for menstruating purposes. And Priyanka wasn't necessarily campaigning for a single-sex toilet, because in the terms of toilet acceptability, there was a writer called Alexander Kira who wrote a very good book called The Bathroom, which I highly recommend. And he established that people generally have a scale of acceptability of when they are prepared to share toilets and who with. So a family toilet is the least threatening because obviously you know who you're sharing it with. Next along is a workplace toilet. Again, you probably know who you're sharing the toilet with, so it's not ideal for it to be mixed sex, but it is more acceptable. In a controlled environment such as a plane or a train, I actually often don't go to the toilet if I see who's just come out of it on a plane or a train. But some people do find those toilets quite difficult. And then you have the public toilet, which can be so many things to so many people. But it is, for women and girls, it is a refuge and a safe space, and should be a safe space around the world. Next slide, please, James. I'm going slightly off topic here because after I wrote my book on toilets, I started to get asked to write about menstrual hygiene, as it was called, and menstrual health. Because one of the things that is striking about the relationship of women and girls with toilets and why they need single-sex toilets and safe spaces is because we menstruate, obviously. And it's been established with variously robust research that girls miss school when they start menstruating if there are no single-sex toilets or safe toilets or toilets where they feel safe in the school environment. And I'm just showing this picture because it's the most extreme example of women's biology being used to marginalize them. And this is called a chowpaddy shed, and it's in Western Nepal. And in some areas of Western Nepal where I traveled a few years ago with WaterAid, women and girls have to live in these sheds for the entire time they're menstruating and a few days before and afterwards, because they are considered so dirty and filthy and polluting. And as you can see, and the cow sheds are in better condition than these chowpaddy sheds, and often the girls can be sleeping in these alone, making them extremely vulnerable. Some have died from snake bites, some have died from smoke inhalation because they have to sleep through these in the winter. And they're just, they are extreme and horrible, but I think they are testament to how women and girls are marginalized for their biology. I mean, they don't even have a toilet, of course. They're not allowed to go to the toilet. They're not allowed to set foot in their own house. And they have to live in this chowpaddy shed. Next picture, please. Just to show you that they are inhabited. So these two women, the girl and woman, will be, at least they have a mosquito net, but they'll be living in that chowpaddy shed for 7 or 8 days, no matter what the weather, for their entire life, until the menopause and they stop bleeding. Married women only have to spend 5 days in these sheds, and girls who are unmarried, I think it's 7 to 8. Final slide, please. And I'm ending with this slide because I want to tell you about finish by telling you about a girl called Grace, who I met in Fishtown in Liberia. And I was very struck by Grace because I thought her story said a lot about the state of development and how aid is applied, particularly when it comes to girls and women in the developing world. And it is true that in the Sustainable Development Goals, that Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is about sanitation, and the interpretation of that goal by, for example, UNICEF does require single-sex toilets to be installed as part of the Sustainable Development Goal. However, in this school in Liberia, in this very small village in Liberia, and I visited, and this girl, Grace, I met this girl, and she put her hand up and wanted to tell her story. And her story was that an NGO had built the school. It was quite new, but the NGO had not thought to build any toilets. And the reason, well, it's baffling why the NGO had not built any toilets, but I think it was operating on a male principle, and the male principle was that it was perfectly okay for the men and boys to go and use the bush for defecation and urination, because that was the norm in the village that didn't have many toilets. But Grace obviously menstruated, and she said that she hated going to the bush, and instead she would wear 2 pairs of trousers and 2 skirts and various other, like 3 pairs of pants or something, when she had a period, just so she could sit through the school day. And that actually makes her exceptional, because a lot of girls, as I said before, actually drop out of school either for a couple of days a month or altogether. I mean, the statistics are not particularly robust. There are a few zombie figures flying around, but generally, and definitely anecdotally, and there are lots of small-scale studies that show that girls and women do drop out of school, or young women do drop out of school. And frankly, I would, if I didn't have a private, dignified toilet in which to change a tampon or change a sanitary pad or empty a moon cup, because NGOs love moon cups. They're always promoting moon cups all over the place, but they're not at the same time promoting single-sex toilets where girls would be not embarrassed to go and stand at the wash basin and empty out their moon cups, which is odd. So I'll end with Grace. That's not Grace, but let's pretend that is Grace. So this is Grace's ideal, is simply to have a very simple toilet with hand washing facilities, ideally a bit more private than those there. But unfortunately, around the world, that's still not the case, and it's still something that we need to keep fighting for. I'll end there.
Thank you, Rose. That was fascinating. I do have one question before I ask Maya if she'd like to take over, and that's 13 years ago that you wrote that book. What have you kept with you in your own life in England that you learned while you were writing it?
Oh, so many things. I suppose I pay attention to public toilets in particular, and I pay attention to the fact that, particularly in the UK, that public toilets are so often the first casualty of any austerity cuts, which is a huge problem for elderly people, for example. I think, I mean, I think a lot about what's called the bladder leash, which is something I learned writing my book. And the bladder leash is when you limit your activities, your daily activities, because you are not sure to find a toilet. And that's happened to me, and it happens to me a lot. And often the answer given, particularly by councils who have closed toilets, is, well, you can use a shop or a pub, but many people are not comfortable just strolling into a pub. And you need to have a bit of sort of chutzpah to walk in as though you're a customer and you're not. So I think about that a lot, and I think about that. I think that's really an unresolved issue, and it's getting worse in public toilet provision. I mean, on the one hand, public toilets are being closed. On the other hand, as we will talk about, they're being transformed into gender neutral toilets, which obviously disadvantages women because it's often the female toilets that are turned into gender neutral toilets. So I think there's a kind of double whammy of toilet provision in this country. And around the globe, things are better. They are better. Things have improved. Numbers have improved. Fewer children are dying of diarrhea, but there's still over 1 billion people without any toilet whatsoever, and I think that's unacceptable.
Maya, do you want to come back in and perhaps follow up on any particular point before you take over?
Yeah, I had a question about the international NGOs. Where's Rose gone? She's back again. Do you see, on one hand, they're promoting safe toilets in the developing world and recognizing that single-sex toilets are needed, and on the other hand, in their headquarters and in their corporate communications, they're saying sex is a spectrum, and you don't need single-sex provision. Have you had any interesting conversations along those lines, or any thoughts on what's going on there?
Not directly, but I've seen. I mean, I keep an eye on like Twitter for as long as it's still going, and and I see all the menstruator nonsense and uterus have a nonsense, and yet these are the same agencies that are promoting women and girls' rights around the world. And I have no answer for how they're getting away with it, but it's a really strange disconnect. And I think I've done a couple of Twitter rants about it a couple of times, particularly with the bigger agencies, or people like Amnesty who are just ridiculous. But I haven't had any direct conversations with these NGOs. I haven't confronted them directly. I've just ranted.
Fair enough.
So, Maya, would you like to pick up now and present our guide?
Yes. So thank you very much, Rose. I'm going to talk about the new short guide that Sex Matters has produced called Toilets Matter. And like everything else that we do, it's focused on the UK. It's based on UK law. And as Rose and Helen said, absolute lack of toilets is not really a problem in the UK. We're part of the flushed and plumbed world. But outside of the house, it's a different issue. We all rely on shared toilets whenever we leave the house. We go to work, we go to school, university, transport, leisure facilities, shopping, nightlife. And if you can't use the toilet comfortably and safely, then it's a barrier to participation in society, particularly for women and girls. So toilets matter. They matter in the UK and they matter globally. Next slide, please. So we wrote this guide on toilets because we did a piece of work earlier this year where we asked people about all kinds of single-sex services, and we got an astonishing response. Over 6,000 people responded in just over a week, and toilets was the number one issue that they talked about, and that's why we then have created this separate guide. Toilets came up again and again as places where people, mainly women, value single-sex clarity, and tales of toilets being removed, being replaced by gender neutral toilets, or toilets not being allowed to be clear that they're based on sex and not on gender identity. These stories came up again and again. And they described organisations tying themselves in knots over toilets and making them feel safe. So that's why we made this guide. It's based on the law and on what people told us in that survey, and also on conversations that we've been having with service providers, with schools, with pubs, with venues. And it assumes that all of these organisations, toilets is not their number one concern, but everyone needs toilets. So their objective is to be lawful and to be comfortable. And for toilets to be simple and easy. They don't need to be toilet experts. They just need to have it simply explained to them. So before I launch into our guide, I want to give you a short taste of what we heard in the Single Sex Services survey. So we're going to play a very short video, which is highlights from that survey. And thank you to everyone who took part in that survey. If anyone's on the call, we read every single comment, and they were moving and they were shocking. And the one thing that stays with me the most from that is women saying, "I didn't go back. The gym, the venue, the cafe, the pub changed its toilets or changed its changing rooms or its showers from being single sex to being gender neutral, and I didn't go back. That place was closed off to me." And when we talk to organisations, they say the reason they're doing this is because they think that single sex toilets are old fashioned, and they're concerned about the law. They're concerned about being sued for discrimination. And so we looked at the law, and the law hasn't changed. There's the Equality Act 2010, which says you're allowed to have single sex services. And that was recently clarified by the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who issued guidance on single sex services, which makes this really clear that service providers can provide clear single sex services, and they should have a written policy and clear signage. Then there are workplace regulations. So your employer is required to have either single sex facilities or unisex fully enclosed rooms. And similarly for schools, for children over 8, schools have to have single sex facilities or fully enclosed rooms. And then local licensing regulations for bars and restaurants are the responsibility of local councils, but they're all quite similar. And they also tend to say the same thing. They don't say you have to have single sex toilets, but they all recognise that single sex toilets are preferable and normal. And then there's the British standard. So the British standard is not law, it's guidance on best practice. And it says explicitly that many men and women seek privacy. Many women and children feel safer when using single sex facilities. And it recommends separate facilities for men and for women should be provided in preference to unisex facilities where possible. That was from 2006. None of that has changed. All of that law and guidance is still there. And then the one in the middle is the building code M. So that is for new buildings. And it also says you should either have single sex facilities or unisex fully enclosed. And the reason why it's flexible is because, buildings come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes all you have is one toilet and it has to be unisex. Sometimes there's room for lots of different varieties. And the numbers depend on the amount of footfall. If an employer has mainly male employees, you don't necessarily have to have the exact same number of toilets for men and women. What you have to have is facilities that allow everyone to use the facilities comfortably for the use of the building. So if we go on to the next slide. No, that's not the next slide. We've missed one. Go back one. Oh, well, we have missed one. Okay, I'll talk about what would be on the next slide. Sorry about that. What we found looking at practice is that the range of toilets that are lawful are not necessarily comfortable. So in practice, you have the traditional single-sex cubicles, and then you have what they now call super loos. So those are those toilets that have a wash basin inside, dryer inside, everything fully enclosed. Those are both clearly legal, but then you also have schools and other places removing single-sex toilets and not replacing them with fully enclosed unisex toilets, but with cubicles where the doors go all the way from the floor to the ceiling and the side of the cubicle goes all the way from the floor to the ceiling. So they say that's an enclosed room, but it doesn't have brick walls. It doesn't feel as safe and as comfortable as a fully enclosed unisex toilet. It's more enclosed than a cubicle, but only just. And the wash basin doesn't have to be inside. So you can have the wash basin outside so that people have to queue together, people have to wash their hands together, men and women. And people tell us that those are much less comfortable. But that's all legal. But people don't like them. No, go back now, sorry. People don't like them. That's what we hear. And the reason why people don't like them is because when you have a single sex toilet with the cubicles inside, although it is there's less privacy between the cubicles, there's more privacy for the overall room. So usually you have 2 sets of doors to get in. Often you have to turn a corner. Usually the women's, if it's in a corridor, they'll put the women's at the end of the corridor so that there's no reason for men to be standing loitering outside the door of the women's. So there's 2 or 3 sets of doors between you and the toilet and the people walking past. Whereas in a mixed sex toilet, there's only 1 door. And that means, sometimes locks don't work, sometimes they fail, sometimes people forget to lock them. And sometimes people can opportunistically use that to, whoops, the door opened. Those stories came up in our survey. And those situations, even if nothing bad happens, they don't feel as safe. You don't have those barriers that prevent people opportunistically using that space to prey on women. Also, men pee on the seats. Urinals are there for a good reason. And if you don't have urinals, then men, particularly in high traffic areas, the toilets get nasty very quickly. And that the people who feel that most are the ones who have to sit down to wee. So what happens is that in those situations, often women will self-exclude. Men will feel less comfortable, but they don't exclude themselves. And we heard lots of stories of, particularly in workplaces where they've changed the toilets on one floor to be gender neutral, all the women walk up 2 flights of stairs to where there are still single sex toilets. They don't like them. I can go to the next one now. Oh, that was the original one. And so replacing those kind of traditional cubicle toilets with superloos, with these fully enclosed toilets with the sink inside. Some employers and service providers think, well, isn't that better? Isn't that more modern? We're not segregating people into male and female, and they have complete privacy. But they're still not as comfortable as single sex toilets. Partly because men wee on the seats. Also, where you have toilets where the walls go all the way down to the floor, they're harder to clean. And the harder it is to clean, the more they get smelly. Also, where you have toilets where each room is completely enclosed, it's harder to ventilate them. So the kind of cubicle toilets with the open top and open bottom don't get so smelly so quickly. And the other thing about cubicle toilets is if someone's in trouble, they can get help. And there's also less privacy for people to get up to no good. So as Rose said, there is this scale from, the most comfortable toilets in your home, in a hotel, in an office where the people there and it's controlled, to the least comfortable places, pubs, nightlife, in the park, in transport hubs, places where lots of people come and go and it's not controlled. And actually having the less privacy of a women's toilet can feel safer than the more privacy of a fully enclosed room, because you can see and hear who's outside. Nobody can push you in, and that people can't hear what's going on. So less privacy is a feature, not a bug, in those shared single-sex toilets, and that's all kind of built into the design of them. It's not that women's toilets are a haven for girl talk and comparing lipstick. It's that they feel safer by design. So that's sort of simple, and all of that is legal. And why would a service provider try to make it less comfortable for most people who prefer single-sex services? So if we go to the next slide. This is one of the worst examples, I think, of where service providers are going wrong, when they're not ripping out the toilets and replacing single sex with fully enclosed gender neutral toilets. They're doing something even worse, which is they're leaving it as it is with the lack of privacy by design. And then they're just putting up a sign that says, if you see someone who looks like they're in the wrong bathroom, don't say anything, don't challenge them, respect their privacy. And that's the worst of all worlds, because you've promised people that they're going into a single sex space and then suddenly it's mixed sex. And this sign is, it's hard to read, it's hard to understand. We don't have bathrooms. It must have come from America. But you see this around, particularly in universities, these kind of signs more often. And we think these are unlawful because the law says you can have single sex toilets and you can have unisex toilets, but you really shouldn't have a toilet that claims to be single sex and then turns out to be unisex. And you shouldn't have a toilet that's mixed sex and that doesn't have the fully enclosed privacy. You certainly shouldn't have a toilet that has open urinals and is gender neutral. That's not a toilet where people feel comfortable. So our advice on the next slide is really, really simple to service providers. Don't do this. Have toilets for men and women and have a unisex option. Have clear signs and have a written policy and train your staff, including, for example, security staff, bouncers for nightlife venues, that people are able to use single sex toilets, and people who try and use the wrong toilet should be challenged and politely directed to the unisex option. That way everyone has somewhere to go, everyone's privacy is protected, no one's discriminated against in using the overall service, and the risk of harassment and conflict is reduced, which is, as I said, service providers don't want to be thinking about their toilets. They want them to be simple. Next slide. We place quite a big emphasis in the guidance on having clear signs. That's the other thing you see a lot of toilets in all kinds of venues doing now, is trying to make it a site of creativity. And really, the less ambiguous you make the sign, the better it is for everyone. Everyone's expectations about which toilets they can use are clear, and there's less room for conflict. And I do go around taking pictures of toilet signs. Next slide. And then the other thing that we say in the guide is to have your policy, write it down, put it on the website, direct people to where the toilets are with clear signs and clear policies, so that everyone knows before they set out what they can expect. Where are the disabled toilets? Where are the women's toilets? Where are the men's toilets? And this is one of the things that the Equality and Human Rights Commission said in their guidance. I think a few years ago, we wouldn't have thought this was necessary. Everyone knew what toilets were. But the more that you make it clear and simple, the less room there is for conflict. Next slide. So then the question about transgender people. Transgender people might want to use the toilet for the opposite sex, but the Equality Act doesn't give them the right to do that, and other people have rights too. So service providers shouldn't discriminate against transgender people, and the best way not to do that is to have a unisex option. So that way you're not forcing people to use sex segregated toilets if they don't feel comfortable. You're making sure everyone has somewhere to go. And as the Equality and Human Rights Commission says in their guidance, you can't judge people on their appearance, and you can't ask people whether they've got a gender recognition certificate. You definitely can't ask people what surgery they've had on their genitals. All of that is private information. So what you need to have is clear rules, clear signs, and direct people to use them. Next slide. Then the guide doesn't cover everything about accessible toilets and changing places, and there's lots of detail about accessible toilets, but it does say what the law says, which is that all organisations have a requirement to provide accessible goods and services. So disabled people should be able to find and use a suitable toilet just as easily as non-disabled people. If you only have one toilet, that should be an accessible toilet. And then with the building regulations, say if you have a toilet with more than 4 cubicles, it should have an accessible toilet in it. So increasingly new buildings or refurbishments have unisex accessible toilet and accessible cubicles, expanded cubicles within the male and female toilets. Accessible toilets don't have to be exclusively set aside for people with disabilities. And so that means, the question arises, if an organisation has a male toilet, a female toilet, an accessible toilet, is that enough to say that everyone is catered for? And the answer is yes, it is. But the organisation must make sure that they have enough accessible toilets for the use of the building. So, for example, if a university has lots and lots of students who say they want gender neutral toilets, it would be a good idea for that university to put in extra gender neutral toilets rather than direct all of those students to use the accessible toilet and take up the space and time where students who need the accessible toilet are waiting for it. But if an organisation, has a trans person who turns up and they don't allow them to use the accessible toilet, it's likely they would face a discrimination case. So again, the thing is to have clear signage and enable people to understand which toilets they can and can't use. On to the next one. So we've published this guidance. It's short and it's simple, and we'd encourage you to, if you have a bad experience in the toilet, do write to, the school, the sports centre, the pub, the headquarters of the chain, and tell them. It's not necessarily that it's unlawful, but they shouldn't want to make their customers uncomfortable, and they need to know when they're making people uncomfortable. Send them our guidance, tell them you're not happy. And I think there will need to be some court cases about toilets, particularly where they've taken out women's toilets and made them all gender neutral, or in the awful cases where they allow men single sex and then only the women is made gender neutral. But most of the time, I think it's just worth going back to the school, the headquarters, Ofsted, particularly where they've ripped out the single sex toilets and they're putting in gender neutral and saying this is making me uncomfortable. This is not inclusive. You could do better. They need to hear that. Next slide. I think that's the end of those.
I think it is, yes. Thank you, Maya. So a lot of chat in the chat and the Q&A about people who have, horrible examples of signs that say things like urinals and cubicles, which means, where are women meant to go, or else urinals and cubicles, which means men can use everywhere and women can use half of them. And then one person says that they have been complaining for 9 months to a particular theatre. In fact, theatres seem to be particularly bad on this, saying, there's nowhere that I'm comfortable in using, and then they're just being brushed off and being ignored. Is it really the case that there's just nothing more they can do at this point if they're not going to take a legal case?
I think it's worth, it depends. It depends on the venue. I think it's also worth, complaining to the council and getting it in the media. Those are all of those things are worth doing. And also, I think when these stories get into the media and onto social media, the more that they hear that this is a problem, the more likely they are to respond. But yeah, if it's legal, then there's not a lot you can do. And the thing is, when they've when they've spent the money on a refurbishment, it's the least likely time they're going to change something. It's when they're about to spend the money on a refurbishment that they really need to hear this is not the thing to do. The other thing is, we heard from the government earlier in the year that they are going to change the building regulations and require that places have male and female toilets. So that will be the other thing with these places that are really recalcitrant, if the government brings in those new regulations.
Rose, someone in the chat says that they don't remember what country it was, but there was a very interesting scheme where places like pubs and shops were encouraged to put up a sign saying that people were free to use their toilets. I wondered what the most creative or impressive, clever thinking rather than big budget things that you saw in your travels were, if there were any.
Not really. The country was the United Kingdom. Actually, there was a scheme in a few councils tried it. I think one was Richmond, and they definitely started doing a scheme like that. I'm not sure how successful it was, but I think the best examples of that is really to have a public toilet that is accessible and safe. And if you are going to make it fee paying, which is another whole issue, then make it obviously affordable for example, if you go to any Indian slum, you'll see sort of toilet relics that have been built by people wanting to be elected, and then they're never maintained, because that's the other secret of toilets, is that you have to maintain them. So actually getting really good community run public toilets that are safe for women, there are examples of them, but they're definitely not widespread, and there's definitely room for more of them. I was once a judge on a competition for I think it was the Royal Institute of British Architects, and it was for a toilet, and the winning design was really interesting. It was a young man who did it, and he'd done a curved it was an entirely public toilet, and he said it was so that people could not lurk around corners. And I thought that was really thoughtful, and I really hope it got built. But it's unusual that a young man would necessarily understand the level at which women are constantly threat assessing, whether it's conscious or not. And I think the public toilet throws that into really stark relief.
Both of you, I'd like maybe a comment on what this means for men's provision as well. I mean, obviously the issues come up much more for women, but we did hear about 10% of the answers on our survey were plaintive men saying things like how much they missed the urinal, how much they didn't want to be making women uncomfortable. Are there any particular things that men can do that help here?
Complain.
Yeah.
Protest.
Yes.
Object to women's toilets being turned into gender neutral toilets. The other issue we haven't really talked about, because we've been quite rightly so focused on safety and vulnerability and the toilet as a refuge, but the other issue, of course, is queuing. And it's really strange to me that theatres are so much on this gender neutral bandwagon, because theatres are already absolutely guilty of having really inadequate toilet provision, because, of course, women take longer to use the toilet. It takes us about 90 seconds on average. Someone has done that research. And men take about 60 seconds. So if you do a one-on-one toilet provision, even if you're having single-sex toilets and you only put the same amount of women's toilets, then women will have to queue, obviously, because we take longer. So for theatres to then think that the solution is to, let's turn them all into gender neutral toilets, which the men will also use, then that's just making their situation even worse. So they're just ensuring that lots of women and men arrive late into the show. So I don't know, it makes no sense to me.
Do you want to add anything, Maya?
No, just that we did hear from, as you say, sort of 10% of men saying they feel equally uncomfortable, and they feel uncomfortable partly, because they know they're making women feel uncomfortable. And they feel uncomfortable in the queue, they feel uncomfortable at the wash basins. And I think, as you say, they should complain and make their voices heard. On the other hand, where you do have gender neutral toilets, just close the door.
Don't pee on the seat.
Don't pee on the seat, yes. So Maya, you and I both met Gussie Gripper, relatively recently. So this is a wonderful comedian whose shtick is all about incontinence, because this is, of course, another issue for women, yet another
Oh God, yeah.
toilet-related issue. And I wondered if there was something that we wanted to bring into this conversation that touched on that issue, that women are already leashed to the home, perhaps by fear of, not being able to sneeze or wetting themselves or whatever. Rose, you looked like you wanted to come in on that too.
Oh yeah, because I have urinary incontinence, because one of the wonderful gifts of the menopause, of which there are many, is that you have it weakens your pelvic floor, so you really have to work at keeping it strong. And so because I'm a runner, that's kind of the worst thing you can do to a weak bladder, because it's essentially a series of jumps, which, as we know, many women, when they see a trampoline, will shudder and avoid it like the plague. So yeah, I have to account for that when I'm running. I have to wear, incontinence underwear, and I mean, it's not the same for me because I don't necessarily suffer when I'm out and about. So it's not that I notice the bladder leach there, but definitely when I'm doing sporting activity, I know that lots of women, either because they've got weakened pelvic floors after childbirth or because they are going through menopause, but I know that lots of them will avoid sport and avoid anything like, a Zumba class, which involves jumping or anything like that. And that's a real shame.
I suppose I'd like to say, though, that, for most people, there are things they can do. So
There
Gussie's
are,
campaign
yeah.
is dry by Christmas. 3 months of doing your pelvic floor exercises and most of us will be okay.
Yeah,
Are we all sitting here doing them?
Everyone clenching and wondering which bits of them they're moving. Yes, indeed. Somebody is asking Maya about cameras and attacks in mixed sex toilets. And these are, of course, the sort of extreme issues, but quite a few of these things did come up. I mean, some shocking stories came up in our single sex survey, didn't they?
Yes, that stories about both toilets and changing rooms of people, having phones slipped under the partition. I think it happens more and more, and also again that kind of design thing about a place that feels unsafe, that feels like that could happen. There were both of those things came up, and also if it's happened to you once, then everywhere feels unsafe after that. And I think a lot of architecture and design, and particularly toilet talk, it gets very engineering. But a lot of thinking about what works to make toilets feel safe and feel comfortable is understanding these softer issues, these experiences that women have had, and things like urinary incontinence and things like upskirting, and how do you design places that feel safe from that. But at the same time, I mean, I think I've started noticing, particularly over lockdown, when a lot of places did refurbishments and then reopened, and a lot of places where they've replaced the cubicles with these all the way up and down toilets. I don't think they've thought through how how that enclosure feels. It also that feels quite threatening and unsafe. So I think which is really, really why we've ended up with single-sex cubicle toilets with this sort of 3 layers of separation, so that there's not going to be a man in the next cubicle slipping a phone underneath. And yeah, it came up quite a lot in the survey.
I think one thing that's really interesting, and maybe we'll finish with this from both of you, is, I know Rose has continued to talk about toilets and think about toilets, because once you start, you never give up on toilets. It's one of those subjects. But you were doing your research, I think, 2006, 2007, 2008, and Maya got interested in toilets, I think, probably around 2020, 2021. And so, Rose, I'd like you to talk a little bit about, what other people were saying and doing when they heard that you were writing about toilets. And then maybe, Maya, you could say that too, because I think maybe the attitudes might have changed quite a lot in that time. Maybe I'm wrong. Rose, let's go to you.
I mean, it was definitely a very different place when I started writing. I mean, there were people in the sanitation field and the toilet field, but it was very small and very niche, and it was definitely a marginal place of area in which to work, whether in the NGO world or working in public toilets. And I think things have changed hugely in the intervening years, particularly around the topic of menstruation. That's changed a lot. It was definitely an absolutely dirty, filthy topic that no one talked about when my book came out. I still don't think that the public toilet is as eminent as it should be, and I wish that there were a greater connect between the need and the provision, or at least the priority given to it. But so I think there's definitely work to be done on that. But I mean, there's all sorts of things wrong with our sanitary system. But I definitely think public toilets, because it affects so many things. It's women's safety, it's elderly care, it's all sorts of boxes that it ticks. And I think the conversation now is definitely louder, and that's to be welcomed. But I think it's definitely changed now, particularly when we're talking about. No one was talking about gender neutral toilets in 2006, 2007.
Yeah, I didn't think they would be. Maya, what about you? What do people talk to you? What do people say when they discover that you're interested in toilets?
Well, I mean, everyone has a toilet story. Everyone has an interest in toilets. But I mean, I think, the thing from the survey was that there were lots and lots of older women who were particularly concerned about this. And I think the shift towards gender neutral toilets is something that's seen as being fashionable. It's seen as being modern. And it's the voices of older women in particular who've lived a bit, who've experienced, who've maybe had some bad experiences in life, and who particularly need access to the toilets that are being discarded. And it's not modern. That's as old as the hills. So that's really sort of what came to me from the survey, and just so many women saying, I can't believe we're having to fight this all over again. Didn't the suffragettes do this? The idea that women having somewhere safe and private and comfortable to go to the toilet is something that we have to fight for in 2022 is just astounding.
And on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say thank you and good night to my panelists, and in particular wish Rose a lovely birthday dinner. And I'm just going to take a couple of the final minutes to tell you a little bit about what Sex Matters is doing, and to ask for your help with one thing that we're up to. So perhaps we could have that slide, please. So we do need your support. If that support is by donating monthly and getting our Sex Matters memo and maybe some merch, that's great. But if it isn't, that's great too, if you're using our materials to start conversations. So you could send somebody the Toilets Guide. So one of the questions that was asked in the chat was what to do if somebody is not providing suitable toilets. Send them our guide. And then go in and ask them, did they read it? So use us to kickstart conversations. And then there are also campaigns that we do that are really, really important. And if you take one thing away from tonight, other than obviously that we have a toilets guide, which I presume you're interested in since you came to an entire hour about toilets, we have a petition. And this petition is to clarify the law on what sex means when it comes to things like discrimination in work and single sex services. It's on our homepage. So if I could just have the final slide, please. Our job is to campaign for clarity on sex in law and policy, and we're a non-profit that's aimed at promoting that clarity. And if you go to our homepage, which is just sex-matters.org, the first thing you'll see is that campaign. It's a petition. It's a petition to get the government to clarify in the law what sex means, that it means male and female. It doesn't mean self-identification. And if we can get 100,000 signatures on that petition, then we're very likely to get a Westminster Hall debate. And that would be great, because it would be the first time that politicians have to stand up and answer questions and ask each other questions. What do you mean when you say somebody self-identifies their sex? Do you mean it's okay for a man who thinks of himself as a woman to go and use the toilet and the shower next to teenage girls? I'd very much like to hear politicians asked that question. And if you agree, please help us to get more signatures on that petition. And with that said, thank you very much to everyone who joined us. And this video will be available on the YouTube channel for Sex Matters very shortly. And have a happy World Toilet Day, everyone. Thank you.